There's a strong case that John Smith functions as the true main character of The Man in the High Castle. While the story begins with Juliana Crane and the Resistance, the emotional gravity, thematic depth, and long-term narrative arc increasingly center on Smith. By the later seasons, the show feels less like a resistance story and more like a study of power, compromise, and identity, seen most clearly through him. At the structural level, Smith has the most complete character arc in the series. He begins as a high-ranking National Socialist official who appears fully integrated into the regime, but the show gradually peels back layers to reveal who he used to be and how he got there. Unlike many other characters whose goals remain relatively fixed, Smith evolves continuously. His trajectory moves from survival and adaptation to consolidation of power, and finally toward confrontation with the consequences of his choices. This long, coherent arc gives him a narrative weight that feels central rather than peripheral. Just as important is that Smith embodies the show's core themes more directly than any other character. The series is fundamentally about questions like, what would you do under a totalitarian system? How much of yourself would you compromise to survive? At what point does adaptation become complicity? Smith doesn't just ask these questions, he lives them. He is not an outsider looking in, he is the system looking back at itself. Through him, the audience experiences the internal logic of collaboration, the slow normalization of brutality, and the psychological mechanisms that make it all feel justified. Smith also serves as the narrative's primary bridge between worlds, not just geographically, but ideologically. He connects the American past to the Nazi present. He understands both systems intimately, which allows the show to explore the contrast between them without needing constant exposition. When Smith speaks or acts, there is always an implicit tension between who he was and who he has become. That tension gives his scenes a density that many other storylines lack. Another reason he feels like the main character is screen presence and narrative focus. Over time, more of the show's most consequential decisions run through him. Major political shifts, strategic conflicts, and turning points often hinge on Smith's choices. Even when he is not physically present in a storyline, his influence is felt. The Reich's direction, the balance of power with Japan, and the fate of multiple characters are tied to his actions. The camera and the story return to him repeatedly because he is where the stakes concentrate. Rufus Sewell's performance amplifies this centrality. He gives Smith a level of psychological depth and consistency that anchors the entire series. The quiet authority, the controlled body language, and the subtle hints of internal conflict make Smith compelling to watch in almost any scene. When a character consistently draws the audience's attention and carries emotional weight across multiple arcs, they begin to function as the story's center, regardless of who was initially positioned as the protagonist. There's also a more subtle narrative reason. Smith represents the show's most uncomfortable perspective. Resistance stories are familiar. Viewers know how to emotionally align with them. But Smith forces the audience into a more complex position. He is both the agent of the system and a victim of it. He benefits from the regime while also being trapped by it. By placing so much focus on him, the show shifts from a simple good versus evil framework to a deeper exploration of how systems shape people and how people, in turn, sustain those systems. Finally, Smith's story carries the highest personal stakes. While other characters risk their lives for causes, Smith risks something more psychologically devastating: his identity, his family, and his sense of self. The contradictions he must maintain, loving father versus enforcer of ideology, American past versus Nazi present, create a constant internal pressure that drives his decisions. This internal conflict is what gives the series much of its emotional intensity, and it is centered almost entirely on him. For these reasons, John Smith can be seen as the series' de facto main character. He has the most fully realized arc, embodies the central themes, anchors the narrative's major decisions, and carries the deepest psychological tension. Even in a show with multiple storylines and perspectives, he is the character through whom the series ultimately defines itself.